Well, when I was thinking about that question, it came to me that it really, in a sense, didn't first occur. I don't know how you make coffee in India, but when I was a girl, we made coffee on a gas stove in a percolator. And there was coffee in a container and water beneath it. And then you would light the gas and it would heat and percolate up, and there would be coffee. And that coffee, in the sense of this question, was how two strands of experience converged. The coffee for me was my upbringing. And the assumption was that all little girls were going to grow up to be mothers. And the role of the mother was, of course, caring and nurturing, but also to sacrifice. The mother was expected to sacrifice her own interest for the interests of the family. When I was 11, our country got into the war. And then mothers were again asked to sacrifice. They were asked to sacrifice their children, at that point, mainly their sons, for the nation, the country. And that was the overarching allegiance we should have. Even the mother would give her children. And in many windows, I would see a little flag, Gold Star Mother. And that was indicating that she had given her son to the nation. And I began to think this nation took her son. Then I began to think about those sons and what was required of them. And they were also brought up to sacrifice. But their sacrifice wasn't for the family, for the nation, although many men did, working hard and supporting families and so forth. But they too were being brought up for the overarching allegiance to the nation and to give what was called the ultimate sacrifice. So I began to think about the parallel expectations of soldiers and mothers and the expendability of all that went into their being. The woman who had devoted her adult life to nurturing a human being for the world, and a human being aspiring to a life in the world who would have to give it up in this great conflagration, this great fire of sacrifice to the nation that we called war. So my first connection was between soldiers and mothers. And somewhere out there, there is a little essay called Soldiers and Mothers that my sisters in the Peace Research Association Education Commission responded to, and we began a conversation around that. So let's go back to the percolator. So the coffee, as I said, was my upbringing and how it made me or led me to see the world and gender roles and the relation of gender roles to the nation and to war. Well, the water was moving from the classroom to what we would now call a Peace Research Institute that was dealing with the problematic of war. And they were using a concept that they called the war system. And the war system they were referring to as part of the so-called Westphalian or nation state system as the mechanism for conflict resolution among nations. With the same kind of view that I was seeing mothers and soldiers, I began to look at the war system, and I asked myself, how can you have a system like that unless there's a lot that surrounds it socially and culturally, which validates and upholds it? So then again, the whole role of gender in relationship to war entered into my thinking. And I began to focus on what sexism was, which was a word just newly coming in the 1970s into the feminist discourse, and the concept of militarism, which was being used mainly to mean the values of the military imposed on the society. But I saw it as I saw the military also as a pawn in the larger system being moved around by the powers of state. So I began to think in terms of the system and the cultural surround, which was upholding it in particular. And part of that was sexism. And sexism was not just prejudice against women or discrimination against women. It was confining both women and men to particular social roles, roles which ultimately would be played out in the war system, even more elaborately than I referred to earlier of the sacrifice in many other ways. One of the other roles that women played in the formation of the culture of the war system was the victim, the one to be defended. Now, everyone had to defend the nation, women and men, mothers and soldiers. But the soldiers had to be motivated to make sacrifices, to do things that they would not ordinarily do out of some motivation that was somewhat personal. What can be more personal than protecting your mother, protecting your sister, protecting your children? So I saw sexism as the imposition of gender roles for the purposes of maintaining the war system. I mean, there are other ways to define it, but in this discussion. And militarism, I saw as the mindset that assumed that conflicts could only be resolved by debilitating or destroying the opponent, and that order, particularly this gender order, could only be maintained by force. Because ultimately, human beings want human fulfillment. They want to be something more than the way they're defined by the system. So the system had to hold all that down. So there are all these elements of force, not only the military force, but the police and gender violence, that there are multiple ways of defining the crime of rape. But as Susan Brown Miller pointed out in her landmark work on rape, women, I think it was rape, women and men, but the role of rape in war as a tool of war, but also the role of rape within the whole social order as a way to intimidate women and keep them enclosed, to keep them controlled. So the militarism was essentially the use of force to impose the will of the state, whether it be order or opposing an enemy, and we were socialized into enemy thinking, or keeping the gender order in place. So those were the connections. that I made between sexism and militarism. Sexism are the behaviors. They're the behaviors of individual persons, the behaviors of groups of all sizes, when those behaviors are antithetical to the equality of men and women. That's sexism, the sexist behavior. And it can be policy, sexist policy. Patriarchy is, in a sense, an abstraction. It's a concept of what constitutes human value. Okay? So patriarchy tends to manifest more in structures and formal organization, including the family is a kind of formal organization that facilitates the behaviors. So when I explain patriarchy in the classroom, I explain it as this structure in which the behaviors take place, and that behaviors are delimited by that structure. And it is a pyramidal structure, which I called the patriarchal power pyramid. And at the top of that pyramid is a very tiny percentage, almost exclusively male, of a few members of the human family who control virtually all of the resources. They have the ultimate control of the resources. Then the resources are distributed down through the pyramid to the degree that they are necessary to hold the pyramid in place. Fortunately, the bottom of the pyramid is the oppressed, who have, and at every level, I have to call your attention, are men and women. Men are always privileged over women in their level. That's one way to keep the whole thing in order, is by convincing them that they have this male privilege. But at the bottom, you have those who are most deprived of everything. And what's really wonderful is the people at the bottom now are coming to the stage of percolation. And it's boiling over. And we saw it in the streets of the United States in Black Lives Matter. We saw it when Native Americans from both sides of the Europeanly imposed border converged together on their common sacred lands to defend them against a fuel oil pipeline. So that pyramid is there. There's no question about it. And sexism operates to hold it there. But it's not going to be there forever. I think we see the connection, as I said before, in our daily lives constantly, you know. I would like to, and I'm sorry I have to keep using American examples, but I know from friends around the world that similar things happen. Let me use two examples. I'll use one American example, and I'll use one from Japan. We have been very much focused since the murder of a man named George Floyd by a policeman in Minneapolis at the beginning of the summer, at the end of May, on police brutality, particularly police brutality against the oppressed. And the police were always part of this military conception. They wore uniforms, they weren't always armed with firearms, but now they have firearms and so forth. So they represent that patriarchal power. So the murder of George Floyd was, in a sense, a visual. We could see that manifestation of a member of the oppressed being put down, his life taken by someone somewhat higher on that patriarchal pyramid in the power distribution in this country. Another aspect of that people don't know about, they know about it, but it isn't as much the focus, is the brutalization of women in police custody and the brutalization of women in any police process. And that happens not only because it is a woman facing a man in the gender disparity, but it happens because it is a clearly visually militarized person who has this power just because of that status. And the woman is simply a human being. And human beings, as human beings, don't have value. They're only labels in this system. The other example I'll give, and again, it's a wonderful example of it's a slow coming to a boil, but the militarization of the world through military bases by the most powerful, the United States being the main one throughout the world. Now, everywhere that there are those military bases, there is an inordinate amount of gender violence. Mm-hmm. And it is not the ordinary gender violence of the local patriarchy, although that exists too. It is the gender violence imposed by the foreign military with complete immunity. Mm-hmm. Because if the civil society calls out these crimes, what the occupying power does is to remove the person. Mm-hmm. So that even if there is an agreement, it's only rarely. And in Okinawa, Japan, about which I know the most, there has been one recent case which did go to the courts, and there have been several. But the most often way of dealing with that is to remove the offending military and put him someplace else where he can do the same thing. Mm-hmm. They do not call it out, and nor do they call out until now. And this is part of the percolation, as is the Okinawan women acting against military violence, is military on military gender violence within the military. Mm-hmm. The percentage of sexual harassment and assault of women military by their fellow soldiers is horrendous. And it has always been kept under wraps. And in the case of the United States, until a few women congressmen started to call it out publicly. So as I say, it's there, but the water is slowly boiling up. Mm-hmm. No, it reinforces it. The cry for capital punishment comes out of that same mentality that the answer to problems is force. And if you can't resolve the problem, you destroy it. Mm-hmm. So on one level, it is we will destroy this source of evil, this violator of our norms and so forth, by taking the life away. But on another level, it is also classic displacement. It's enemy imaging, because no matter what the crime, but in this case, we're talking about gender violence, it is placing upon one person the guilt of the society that made that behavior possible in the first place. Not all of it. We know, there are various circumstances and individual motivations and so forth. But the general surround has always given a pass to rape. Mm-hmm. And now with the boiling up, more than ever, the patriarchy has to assert, we are handling this. We're going to punish, we're going to eliminate the purveyors, the perpetrators. They don't say, oh my gosh, look at the society. Look what we have created. Maybe we should look at ourselves. Maybe we should start reflecting on the degree to which we can commit political, economic, and environmental, as well as gender rape every day. Those are the kinds of issues that we should be raising up when we stand against capital punishment. And believe me, that's a hard stand to take. I know it, because when these things happen, I just get so distraught and so angry. But ultimately, I have to make myself realize that unless I use that anger for constructive purposes, it only adds to the problem. Yes. So I make me think. And I think we have to find other ways of dealing with it. And the fundamental way is to start looking at the cultural changes, the social changes, the structural changes that we need to address all these problems of violence.